growing your own seedlings is something I know you can do, especially when you know the possible hiccups and how to avoid them before you start. Today I'm going to share with you the 12 most common mistakes and how to avoid them when growing your own seedlings. Let's get growing. Hello and welcome to the Purposeful Plant Podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant. Welcome to the Purposeful Plant Podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in Episode 6 of Season 1, we're going to talk about common seedling mistakes. Now, I know I've mentioned the number one mistake, and we're going to be talking about that again today, but there's also a few other mistakes. I really don't like calling them mistakes. Maybe bumps in the road or hiccups that can really hold back a beginner. They're mistakes that can creep up on you without you really noticing them. These little things can creep up to be really big problems. And so that's what we're going to be really talking about, is these little hiccups, these little bumps in the road that can be fixed with either supplies or a little bit of knowledge that can help prevent some really big problems down the road. And if this is your first time listening today, thank you for joining the Red Ridge Farm community of fellow growers. You guys are my fellow growers. Together, we are growing a healthy family. We're growing a garden. We're growing a homestead. We're growing together. So let's get back to these little hiccups that can come up when we are starting our seedlings. So the first one is using the wrong soil. Now, I've had lots of questions given to me about, do I really need to use the seedling starting mix? And the answer is yes, you do. And it also is no, you don't. So there's a little bit of variable to this. So yes, you do need to use it to start your seedlings. It's made to help germination of your seeds. Now, when you go to potting up, we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. You do not need to continue to use the seedling starter mix. That's when you can start moving into a potting mix that is all natural, doesn't have a slow release fertilizer. So the answer is, for germination, yes, you need to use a seedling starting mix. I know it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's what is needed for germination. And then once you start potting up your seedlings into bigger pots, and we're going to talk about potting up in a little bit, then you can transfer that into another potting mix, but you do not want to go into garden soil yet. That's when you're going to be putting them out into the garden after hardening them off. That's when you're going to use garden soil. So you don't want to bring garden soil, go out and dig up a bunch of soil and bring in to start your seedlings. Next thing is warmth. Warmth is going to have to do again with germination. The biggest hiccups that most beginning seedling growers deal with is, we know how to take care of seedlings, right? Because we've been growing a garden for a while. Usually people who start seedlings have been growing a garden for a while. Then they want to take on the adventure of starting their own seedlings. So what is the difference between starting seedlings and growing a garden or purchasing seedlings? We know how to take care of the seedlings. It's the germination process that we struggle with. That's the thing that's been taken out of the equation when we go buy our own seedlings, is someone else has germinated that plant for us, someone else who's taken care of that seedling for us until we go to get it, harden it off, and put it in our soil. So we only have one step, and that's hardening off and putting it into our soil. So when we're growing our own seedlings, the first thing we're going to need to learn about, and a lot of these are a little bit to do with germination, but not all of them, is we need to figure out the hiccups and things that can happen with germination. So that's going to be, one of those is going to be warmth. And when I went through the supply list a few episodes ago, we went over a seedling heating mat. And what a seedling heating mat is going to do is going to bring up the soil temperature for certain seeds to germinate. So tomatoes are going to need a higher soil temperature. Now, this year I've started seedlings for a long time, but this year I'm actually going to start celery. Celery is something that's a little more advanced, but I'm still learning. So it said on the back of my seed packet that I needed to make sure my soil was above 50 degrees, but below 70 degrees. So I actually tested it, and that means I don't put it on my warming mat because that's going to be too warm. So this mistake or this bump is not knowing what temperature your seeds should germinate at per variety. And the next thing is going to be lights. Now, I've talked to you guys about this before, but you cannot start seedlings and put them in your window and have them to have enough light. You're going to need to invest in some kind of artificial light, especially if you're doing long-term seedlings like tomatoes and peppers and onions. They're not going to be getting that light in the early spring because the sun just doesn't make enough light. I mean, it makes enough light, but it's not up long enough during the day to give those seedlings the light they need. And that's why a lot of new beginners with seedlings struggle, is because they don't want to do the full investment first, because lights are an investment. They want to try it out, so they put a few seedlings in the windowsill. And that is fine if you're doing something like lettuce that's only going to be there for a week or two. But if you're going to be doing something like celery that's supposed to be 10 to 12 weeks, onions that are 10 to 12 weeks, tomatoes and peppers that are 6 to 8 weeks, that's 6 to 8 weeks. All those weeks are before you put them out in the garden. Then they're going to need some kind of artificial light to give them enough light. And why this is a bump in the road is because lack of light can lead to legginess, and then legginess can lead to problems out in the garden. So legginess is when a plant is really reaching and stretching for that light, so it actually grows more vertical than it needs to, and it also grows so quickly vertical that it kind of outruns its roots. It becomes so vertically tall that it just outruns itself. Once it gets so tall, they have struggle bringing in water. They have struggles bringing in nutrients because their root system is not big enough yet to support this really tall, big plant. So the next thing comes with water. So we were just talking about water with nutrients coming up into the plant. But water also, if you're not giving enough water, your seedlings will suffer. If you're giving too much water, that can lead to something called dampening off disease, which is actual fungus that grows on the top of your soil and will almost looks like a squirrel or a mouse comes in and chops off the top of your plants. But it's actually a fungus that just is so penetrating that it slowly just cuts off the top of your seedlings. Water is a very essential part of growing a plant. They need it for many things, like water is usually what fertilization travels with. But also, on the other side of that, your plant also needs air. Now, they don't breathe air like we do, but they do have air. They do bring it in through with their roots. So if their roots are too saturated, then they just can't bring in the air. And then also, if you're too dry, they can't bring up the nutrients that plant needs. So if you're fertilizing them, but then you're not giving them enough water, which we're going to get into fertilization in a minute, that they just can't suck that in. But first, it's time for the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share a few bonus tips and tricks that I use here at Red Ridge Farm. So this tip and trick is brought to you by the Seedling Supply List. And this supply list was designed to help you get all the things you need to grow your own seedlings without having to make several trips to the store. And you can get your own copy at www.redridgefarms.org/resources, or you can go to the link in the description. So the tip for this week is going to be about, we're in the middle of March, and right now, yes, we can't get out in the garden. We can't be planting any of our vegetables yet. March is also a great time to start taking care of the flowers, our perennials that have overwintered, and we're not really busy in the full spring yet, and they're not fully out of their dormancy. So it's a great time to prune your roses, clean up your flower beds, It's also a great time in later March when they're just coming out of their dormancy to start separating. Like my iris bed is getting a little overrun, so I'm going to be out there in the next couple weeks separating those out and finding new places to spread out some of my irises. So let's get back to bumps in the road when it comes to growing your own seedlings. So before we said water, and now we're going to talk about fertilization. So water is very important because that's what moves the fertilization. Fertilization is something that doesn't need to be done right away. In fact, seedlings will not suck up fertilization because that little seed has everything they need until after their true leaves form. So what are true leaves? So when you're looking at your seedling, and almost any seedlings, when they first germinate, there's two little leaves, little cotyledon leaves that form. But then after that, you're going to get your first true leaves, which is the leaves that actually look like what you planted. So if you planted tomatoes, these are going to be the leaves that look like tomato leaves. If you planted a cucumber, these are the leaves that are going to look like cucumber leaves. So fertilization does not even need to happen until after those grow. It's all been organized by God to have all the fertilization your little plant needs in that seed, so that when it's growing and doing its thing, it has all that in its seed, and it pulls from that until the roots are big enough to actually bring in more nutrients. And that sign is those true leaves. Now the plant is big enough to start growing itself. It's starting to express itself. So that means it's ready to take in more nutrients. And you want to be very important when you're doing fertilization for seedlings is they do not need very much. And that's why I mentioned before, when you're potting up, you do not want to get a slow release fertilizer in your soil, because that slow release fertilizer could be too much for them. So you want to use something that is very low key. You do not want, and because seedlings are very prone to fertilizer burn, and you can just use a very low key natural fertilizer. I myself use fish poop. One, because it's liquid, so that means the plant can absorb it up more quickly. Also, because it's liquid, what I mean by liquid is I dilute it in a bunch of water. So I can spray it on the actual leaves, and the leaves can suck it up that way, or they can bring it in through the roots through their water system. Because remember, fertilization travels through the water. So the biggest thing with fertilization is you're wanting to not stress out your plants and give them too much. So you can even tell when you're looking at your young seedlings what they're lacking with different, like how they look, if they need nitrogen, if they need phosphorus, if they need potassium. Because how they look and how they form, those three, they're the big three of fertilization because they're so vital for growth. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is thinning and potting up. So I mentioned that a little bit earlier, and I told you we were going to get to it. So what is thinning? So thinning is when you go to plant your tomatoes and you want to keep your germination rate high. So you put 2 seeds per cell instead of 1. And you do that just so that you know at least 1 is going to come up, especially if you're using cheaper seed. But if you are wanting to grow that tomato to be a nice, robust, good plant, you can't have 2 of those little seedlings in that cell. They're going to compete for nutrients. They're going to compete against each other. So you're going to have to thin one. That means snip one off. And also, I know some gardeners, which I myself, if I do beets, I try to put 4 in there, and that's called multi-sowing, and that's perfectly fine because that's what I plan to put there. Is I plan to put 4. They're going to grow fine. But if I accidentally had a slip of hand and 6 of them come up or 7 of them come up, then you're going to need to be thinning those out. Now, what is potting up? Potting up is when you make mistake number 12 that we're going to get to, and your little seedling's not little anymore. And no matter how much nutrients you give it, it just doesn't seem to be growing. And that means it needs new soil. It needs a bigger spot to spread out its roots and really take hold, so to support the top of the plant. A plant is not going to, unless it is manipulated in some way, outgrow itself. So we talked about the manipulation when we were talking about light and legginess, because the light was manipulating it for it to grow really tall because it needed to reach the light. It needed to get more light, but the roots weren't growing fast enough. So what will happen is if the roots don't have room to grow, they will stunt themselves out. They'll stop growing, and then they'll stop the plant from growing. So potting up means you put them in new soil. And remember, you don't have to use the seedling starting soil. You can use a potting soil that has vermiculite in it, has some more fresh compost in it, and is a little bit thicker, or not thicker, I wouldn't say, just bigger particles than the seedling soil, so that those roots really have something to grab onto. And when I was talking about seedling supplies a few episodes ago, one of the things that I do to help me with that potting up is I use soil blockers. I go from the smallest size to the next size, and as that plant grows, I just keep moving them up into the bigger soil, into where I actually, by the time I get my tomatoes out, they're in a big 4x4 square. And potting up is only going to be for things that are going to be in your growing area, in your seedling growing area for a long time. So things like onions, things like celery, things like tomatoes, peppers, anything that's going to be in there from the 8 to 12 weeks. Those are the ones that are going to need to be potted up. Or if you happen to do mistake number 12, which we're going to get to, you're going to have to pot up a lot quicker with a lot of different things. So that gets us into hiccup number 7, which this can be for even if you purchase seedlings or if you grow your own. Hardening off is how you slowly get your seedling to enjoy the environment that it is in. So when it first emerges out of the soil, it's this tiny little thing, and it slowly grows and gets used to the environment it is in your seedling growing area. And then now you're going to be moving that seedling out to the garden, which is a totally different environment. So hardening off is allowing your plant to have a few days, have a few weeks in the way that I do it, to get used to that new environment slowly and gradually, so that when it's ready to go out into the garden, it doesn't experience seedling shock. And the next is giving up. So when you are first starting out with seedlings, like I said before, the biggest trouble that we are dealing with is germination. This is a step we just haven't dealt with before. We do have germination when we plant things out in the garden and we direct sow it, but we're not constantly watching it. It's kind of like we plant it, we water it, we let it do its thing. But when we have those seedlings in our view, it's kind of like how a watch clock never seems to, when time just slows down when you're watching the clock. The same thing can happen with our seedlings. We are so busy trying to make sure these seeds are taken care of. We want to make sure they get enough water. We want to make sure that they're coming up. And they're in a place that goes into our next thing. They're in a noticeable place. That's mistake number 9, is that we don't put our seedlings in a noticeable place. So sometimes we forget about them, especially when we first started. But when they're in that noticeable place, we're always looking at them. It seems like they're never going to come up. They're never going to come up. They're never going to come up. But guess what? Everything has its own time. Every single vegetable variety, every single flower variety, if you look at the back of your seedling packet, it talks about when you are going to be seeing germination. And then you need to judge from there. But a lot of new beginners worried that they've passed that germination stage, and that comes to a few more mistakes that we're going to talk about in a moment. But now it is time for the Growing with God section of our episode. This is a place where in each episode we spend a little time growing with God. And this segment is brought to you by the Seed Variety Tracker. Like I said before, you can get your Seed Variety Tracker, your own very own copy, that was designed to help you organize your seeds so that garden planting is a breeze. I know that kind of rhymes. You can get that at www.redridgefarm.org/resources, or you can get it in the description box. So today, for the growing a relationship with God, we're going to be talking about Galatians 6:9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So in our growing journey, it is very easy, especially when we are doing good, when we're doing the good things, when we're feeding our family healthy food, when we're trying to get our family outside to exercise, when we are trying to grow our own food, when we're trying to start a homestead. It's easy to become weary. It is easy to not necessarily want to give up, but it's hard to see the harvest sometimes. Sometimes when we're deep down in all of that hard work of getting our seedlings started. Right now, we purchased our meat chickens for the year, and right now it's like, oh my gosh, that season is coming up. We're going to be moving them every day. It's easy to become weary in that when we forget about the harvest. It says that for at the proper time, we will reap a harvest. Everything we do to grow food for ourselves, to grow a homestead, to grow a healthy family, it's not going to be instant results. And God is giving us that courage, that understanding that He is there to help us along the way. He knows that doing the good things can become weary. He knows that the proper time is going to reap a harvest. And we just need to, when we're feeling that worry, we need to lean on Him. We need to take His understanding and understand that the harvest is coming. It's going to come. Your vegetables, your seedlings that you're working so hard right now to grow are going to bring you a harvest. The time spent with your family, the getting them outside, the giving them healthy food, even when they don't want to eat it, it's going to give you a harvest someday. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be at breakfast time when they don't want to eat what you gave them. But it's going to come. And every time you feel that worry, it's a perfect time to let up that little prayer that says, hey, Lord, I'm feeling the weary. Help me through it. Hey, Lord, I need you today. I'm ready for the harvest. I know it's coming, but today I need a little help in doing the good. So let's get back to our seedling mistakes. And remember, they're not mistakes. They're just little bumps in the road. I talked about putting them in a noticeable spot. I hit on it a little bit before, but it's very important. It's very understandable. One of the very cornerstones of permaculture. Remember, permaculture is the design of finding relationships in nature, finding relationships in what works, what God made that works. It's also the design element. One of those design elements is putting things that need our attention more in a more noticeable spot. When we put a mess, like for example, I'm very I do not like to clean my house. I'd rather go clean my barn. But if I keep that mess right there on the table and I have to walk by it every single day, it creeps up on me. I need to do it. I see it. I need to do it. But if a company comes up and I clean that mess up really quickly and I shove it to a closet, guess what? I forget about that mess. It doesn't get found until I eventually have to go open that closet and I find the mess. The same thing happens with permaculture. If we put something that needs more care, like seedlings, in a spot that we're going to pass them every day on our kitchen table, I personally have them downstairs so that I know once I finish my outdoor chores, I have this switch of I walk into my seedling area. That's what I do. And then I go upstairs to finish breakfast and do all those things. So those seedlings are in a noticeable area so they don't get forgot. Because like I told you before, remember, watering is very important. Light is very important. Warmth is very important. And if we forget about those things, about those little caring things, and go a couple days before we water, they may not germinate because remember, water is needed for germinate. Or maybe we go a couple days and we don't, or a week or so and we forget about fertilization, they're going to struggle. So we have to keep those seedlings in a noticeable place. And that also leads into the most important thing we need to notice when we are starting our seedlings is the back of our seedling packet, right? The back of our seed packet has so much information. There is, I think a lot of times it's like we look at our seedling packet, and I have talked about seedling or seed information overload in a previous episode. I will link that episode in the description. I believe it's called How to Avoid Seed Information Overload. But I talk about that on the back of our packet, sometimes there's so much information that we just don't know what to do with it. So we get the little tidbits that we think we need, like soil depth, and that's how deep we plant it. And then we just avoid it. We don't look at germination time. So that goes back to hiccup number 8, where we give up too early because we didn't look at our seed packet and say, hey, we have 14 days, but we gave up on day 12. And then also like harvest dates, and it'll even say in the little description, well, tomatoes should be started indoors because they need 6 to 8 weeks before going out into the garden, before first frost is what it usually says. And so that's right there on that on that seed packet. It's telling you which varieties need to be started indoors, which varieties can be started outdoors. So when you're really doing your garden planning or really figuring out what you're going to grow, looking at the back of that seed packet is going to give you the information you need. And I know it's very easy to get information overload, but I've worked that out a little bit for you by creating a download for you called the Seedling Variety Tracker, where it really helps you put all that seed information in one spot. It makes it very easy, all planned out for you so you can utilize every bit of that information. Part of reading the back of the seed packet, which I just talked about, can help with garden planning. Well, what is garden planning really? Garden planning is the records we keep. So it is very important that when we're doing our seedlings that we keep a record as to when we started that seedling. So when we're looking at germination dates, if we don't remember the day we actually did it. Well, was it Monday? Was it Tuesday? Maybe it was Thursday. I'm not sure. And then we look at our back of our seed packet, right? And it says 14 days, but we don't remember the first day we should be counting from. That's another reason people sometimes give up, is because there's just all of this information that's not being kept track of. We give up on those seedlings right before they're going to germinate. If we avoid bump number 10, by looking at that seed packet, we also need to go into bump number 11, which is to keep those records. Keep a record of when you started that seedling. And it also is a record as in maybe that seed did germinate, but it had a really low germination rate. And so germination rate means like if you plant 10 seedlings, how many of those 10 seedlings actually come up. So if 8 come up, that's an 80% germination rate, which is really good. But if you plant seedlings and you do 10 of them, but only 2 come up, that's a low germination rate. That's a record that you need to be writing down. And that could mean a simple thing as going back through some of these bumps and be going, I wonder if the soil wasn't warm enough. Let's try germinating those again, but actually put them on the warm mat. See if you get a better germination rate. Or it could be like my celery. It said that I couldn't have temperatures over 70 degrees. And I know putting my seedlings on my germination mat, that starts at 70 degrees. It's usually 68 to 75 degrees is usually what I can keep right there. So that means that celery wouldn't have had a good germination rate because of the soil temperature. So keeping those records, looking at what does good, what doesn't do good in germination. Like you've probably heard my bean story before, but I had this variety of beans that I grew them in my garden, but I didn't like the taste of them. And I never wrote it down. I always tried to keep it in my head of which one I didn't like. And the one I always remembered when I was ordering was the one I didn't like. So I have lots of the ones I don't like. So that gets us into, so we're talking about records. That gets us into the number one mistake. And I know I've talked about this before, but it is so important to not start your seedlings too early. And that goes back to bump number 10, where you are looking at your seed packet, and bump number 11, when you're looking at your record, keeping records, to know, according to your zone, when you should be starting your seedlings. So for me, I grow in a zone 4, but when I start my seedlings is going to be a totally different time when someone grows in a zone 2 or grows in a zone 5 or grows in a zone 10. And so what a growing zone, I'm going to just click on it really quick. But a growing zone is, for me and everyone, it's this length of time that we can grow things outside when there's no frost. So like a zone 2 or a zone 1, they have no days of no frost. So it's really hard to grow things there. Whereas zone 10, they have no days of frost. There's no days that the soil is frozen. So things are going to grow there. And so for myself in zone 4, I have 107 days of soil that is unfrozen and no frost. So no frost is when you get that really cold temperature. It drops really low in the evening and at night and then kills all your things. I've experienced it. And then the next day, it's a beautiful day. But that 2 hours of below freezing, that's what a frost is. It's temperatures below freezing enough to frost or freeze any dew on the ground, that those seedlings will have, those plants will have perished in that time. So that's why keeping good records and knowing when those dates are for you in your zone is going to help you get those seedlings put out at the proper time. And I have a great story, that I've shared where I actually myself started my seedlings at the wrong time, and how I spent a lot of extra money, a lot of extra time potting up a lot of tomatoes, because I grow 50 to 55 tomatoes every year, a lot of tomatoes, and spending a lot of time on soil and carrying very big pots out to be hardened off. And all of those little problems can increase. And that's why we're really talking about these little bumps in the road that can lead to big problems. So just by missing that date, that certain date of when you need to be planting them, too early is more detrimental than too late. Too late just means you're going to have smaller plants, getting them out into the garden. So being too late is actually not too bad of thing. It's when we're too early that things really start falling apart. Remember that I will be including all of these tips and tricks, all of these extra resources in the description box. So don't forget to check out the description box. And let's just do a real quick recap. So number 1 is wrong soil. Number 2 is warmth. Make sure those seeds are at the right warmth for germination. Number 3 is light. We do not want legginess. You need to provide enough light. A windowsill is just not going to be enough. The next is water. We want to make sure they get enough water, but not too much and not too little. Fertilization, we want to make sure that happens at the right time. Thinning and potting up, that's going to help us make sure those plants are really taken care of. Make sure they have the soil that they need. Make sure they're not competing with another seedling in their own little cell, own little soil block. And then hardening off. Help those seedlings have a little chance to get used to being outside, and don't give up. I know a lot of this stuff might be a little bumpy, seem like a lot of bumps in the roads, but the biggest thing is you don't give up and you keep on growing. And reach out to someone. If you're struggling about things, I know this is a little bit off subject, but if you feel like you're struggling a little bit with your seedlings, before you give up, go talk to your person at your at your garden growing center. I know I do. I ask my growing center a lot of questions. And also find someone like myself or someone else and in fact, if you want to reach me, I will put You can go to my website, www.redridgefarm.org. I have a contact form that you can really contact me or on my Facebook groups or on my Facebook page, and you can really get in contact with me and just ask me a simple question. And I'm more than willing to help you out. And so ask questions before you give up. And then number 9 is put everything in a noticeable place. We are creatures of habit. So if we put things where we're going to notice them, especially those first couple of weeks when you're first starting your seedlings, they're going to get taken care of. Next, number 10 is look at the back of your seed packets. There's so much information there. They're definitely worth looking at. And use those seed packet information to keep records. Write down how well it germinated. Write down if it was more leggy than another plant. Write down if it got more blossom and rot than another tomato. Write down if it tastes good or not. Also, make sure you're planting your seedlings at the right time, and it's very easy to do. You just need to have a seedling calculator. I personally have a seedling masterclass that I teach where I show you guys all about how to find your growing zone, find the exact dates you should be planting, and I go through all these little problems right here. I go through all of them, show you exactly how to use the equipment, and so much more. So I want to thank you guys for joining us today. And don't forget to grab a resource. Remember, I got a couple for you in the description box. So just my go-to right now is just say, hey, go check out this description box and see what more you could learn about growing your own seedlings. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining the journey, and pray just plant. This week's episode is brought to you by the Red Ridge Farm Seed Variety Tracker. This database was developed to help you keep a digital log of your seeds. I've done it. Maybe you've done it. You've gone out to the garden. You used up all your seeds. You throw away the seed packet. You forget about it. And then you decide you really love those green beans and you want to grow them again, but you can't remember the name of them because you threw away the seed packet. This database was designed to help you keep track of all of those things. So no matter what happens to the seed packet, you still have all the information you need to keep growing. Get your free copy. Go to redridgefarm.org/resources.